Hi there, I'm Jason Ross with the Schiller Institute, and I'm very happy today to be speaking with Hussein Askary. Born in Iraq, Hussein Askary has been the Southwest Asia Director of the Schiller Institute for 15 years. Welcome, Hussein.
Thank you, Jason.
Today, we're going to be taking up what has occurred recently with the decision by the Biden administration to drop 7 bombs on Syrian territory near the Syrian-Iraqi border on February 25th. The statement from the U.S. Department of Defense was that these targets were chosen carefully, quote, very deliberately, that this really was a defensive strike meant to help protect American forces and coalition partners. This is how the strike has been presented to the American public as being necessary and in defense. Could you tell us what actually happened? What was this bombing? Was it defensive?
I don't think it's defensive. It has nothing to do with the security situation for the U.S. forces or anything. I mean, the targeting of a few poor Iraqi forces, militiamen or whatever, inside Syria on the border in Abu Kamal, long way from where the U.S. base in Erbil was targeted, and also the American embassy. So this was more an symbolism. It's a show of force. But let me start with this. I think, but because this has been, I'm not going to throw all the reactions because, we had international reactions. We had even inside the United States reactions saying that this is illegal in terms of international law and also in terms of the American Constitution, because it's an act of war and the Congress has not been involved in this decision. This is, as we, exactly the same thing happened a year ago when, before the assassination of Iranian Major General Qassem Soleimani in Baghdad and the head of the militias. Before that, something exactly similar, a copycat, a probably false flag attack on an American base, also in northern Iraq, was followed by an attack on the Iraqi militias. By the way, the Iraqi militias, most of them are under the defense ministry, and the commander-in-chief is the current prime minister of Iraq. So they were actually put under the Iraqi army after ISIS was defeated in Iraq. And those people are fighting ISIS, the remnants of ISIS, on the border between Iraq and Syria. It has nothing to do with American forces there. So the issue is that this was an ominous, what happened last year was an ominous development, which made Iraq even more unstable. This bombing is not going to help stabilize Iraq. On the contrary, we might have more provocations. And until now, nobody really knows who attacked the American bases. There is no evidence presented that it was exactly these two groups named, that Kataib Hezbollah and Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada there. There is no evidence that they were involved in these attacks. So it could be a false flag, it could be a provocateur, a third party, and so on and so forth. But this has been the situation in Iraq for a very long time. And as you know, Iraq went through several wars since 1991 with the Bush Senior and Thatcher war, the so-called Kuwait War, the Gulf War, which destroyed half of Iraq's infrastructure. Then we got followed by genocidal economic sanctions, which destroyed Iraq's education, healthcare, and hundreds of thousands of people, mostly children, were killed. And then Iraq was invaded again by the British-US coalition, and even more destruction was wrought on Iraq. But since then, we have had an unstable situation. And the fact that Iran is being pulled into this discussion. Yes, Iran has a great deal of influence in Iraq, but the problem is that with the destruction of the Iraqi state, which was Tony Blair's idea, recreating Iraq, and changing the political system into an ethnic sectarian system where different ethnic and sectarian groups share the political power, but it becomes like horse trading the whole time because all these parties are corrupt. They have no idea how to deal with the economy, with the unifying the nation. And we have had corruption and economic disaster for the last 17 years. Iraq merely sells raw oil, and then most of the money is actually stolen by these different political parties democratically, and the rest is used to fulfill Iraq's consumption needs: food, clothing, medicine, everything. Everything is imported from outside Iraq. So the oil revenues come from the front door and they immediately disappear from the back door, and nothing is built. For example, electricity in Iraq, we still have only 4 hours of the national grid per day provided to the households and to the businesses. And like you just experienced that in Texas. And that's the situation in Iraq. All services, everything is simply non-functional. Now, I really want people to watch the Schiller Institute, the one you organized yesterday, Saturday, on the importance of the major powers cooperation. Because what Helga Tsep-Larouche said, the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, is very, very important, because she started her opening remarks by pointing to this incident and saying that this can bring us to the brink of a global war, because the Russian and Chinese reactions were very, very strong. And they called on the United States to abandon that geopolitical destructive policy and start to have, to respect international law, but get into a dialogue on solving all these problems. And of course, the real issue then becomes, how would the major powers and regional powers work together to stabilize the situation? And I think Helga made it very clear that it's economic cooperation, which is the basis for such a new order in the region.
So what you just went through about how so much of Iraq's consumption is financed by export of raw materials, as opposed to using raw oil, making products from it, refining it, and then developing the full industrial base. What is going to make it possible for Iraq's economy to be upgraded from one of limited productivity towards being a truly productive nation? How can that happen?
Well, in 2002, I was working with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche on a conference which was held in Abu Dhabi by the Zayed Center in the United Arab Emirates. And it was a conference on, the future of oil in international politics. And what Mr. Lyndon LaRouche presented there was a very fascinating thing, but also shocking. I mean, we had like oil ministers from the region. We had the whole UAE cabinet sitting there in the front row listening to Mr. And he said, stop exporting raw oil. You should build nuclear power plants, and then use the oil as an industrial feedstock for chemical, petrochemical, plastics, and all kinds of products, which will increase the added value of the raw oil many times. Here's we have Mr. LaRouche. To his left is the oil minister of the UAE at the time. And so he said, you have two important things. You have, of course, the oil, but if you build nuclear power, which Abu Dhabi did, actually, now they are completing the largest nuclear power complex in nearby Abu Dhabi with the help of the Korean company. But then he said, you should use the fantastic geographical location of Southwest Asia, which people call the Middle East, as a crossroads for world trade and economic cooperation along what we have. I think we have some picture of what Mr. LaRouche's concept of the world land bridge, which now is termed adopted by China as the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you look at the region called the Middle East, it's right in the middle between Asia, Africa, and Europe, which gives it a fantastic possibility to both for growth, but also contribute to international. As we have in this other slide, you see that this region, but also Iraq specifically, is located on both the maritime Silk Road through the Gulf, reaching to Basra in southern Iraq, and then connecting to Syria on the Mediterranean, to Iran, to the Caucasus, to Turkey, and to Europe. So Iraq could become a very interesting hub for communication, for trade, and integration of that region with the global economy economically. So we have, for several years, I mean, this is the map we have developed in cooperation with Mr. LaRouche, especially after his Abu Dhabi visit. And of course, we have in the World Land Bridge reports we have produced together. And it is also part of what we have proposed for ending the war in Syria, ending the war in Yemen, which is another terrible situation where millions of people are threatened. Even in Syria, millions of people are threatened because of the war situation. And also there's real risk of famine, both in Syria and in Yemen, because of the economic blockade. They are not even allowed to buy food from the international markets or medicine. So in that sense, if we present this new policy, and there is enormous interest from China, Russia, and others to actively work with Iraq, with Iran, with Syria, and the Gulf countries to establish, to turn this region into a workshop. Now, one of the interesting things that happened and then ended up becoming a total disaster is in 2019, the Iraqi prime minister in September 2019 went to China with a huge delegation with ministers, but also most governors from all the different cities in Iraq. And they stayed there for around a week. They visited many places where you have industries, ports, infrastructure, construction sites. And they activated an agreement which was already signed in 2018, but was not active. So the Prime Minister Adel, Abdel-Mahdi and his delegation, they signed a specific financial appendix to what is called now the Oil for Reconstruction project, which I have described earlier. I'm writing an article now for the LaRouche publication. Executive Intelligence Review will be published next week. And it's a fantastic mechanism for Iraq to take a small fraction of its oil, export it to China, and in return, China and Iraq jointly establish a fund with credits for basically infrastructure projects, where Chinese companies will use that oil money and loans from Chinese banks. And it's very long-term loan agreements, 20 years. So it doesn't cost Iraq so much, but the Chinese companies will start working on rebuilding the Iraqi power production and power grid, building and expanding the railways, the roads, building hospitals, thousands of schools, cleaning the rivers, building irrigation and sewerage systems and ports, airports, all kinds of things. And all could happen at the same time.
Hussein, allow me to ask you, this is the sort of thing that I'm sure has been opposed, possibly. I don't know what's going on in Iraqi politics on this, but these kinds of deals that involve China, where China provides the great majority of the financing, this is something that China is attacked for under the idea that it's deliberately creating a debt trap, that it's creating a condition where it finances investment in another country, and then that country is stuck with debt to China, and then China has a huge leverage over that nation. Is this a concern for Iraq?
No, in the beginning, there was that kind of propaganda by pro-US, pro-British forces and media in Iraq. But as I will explain soon, this has been removed because there's no truth to this death trap story. It has never happened in any place on the planet. These are concoctions of the geopolitically minded people who want people to stay away from cooperating with China and the Belt and Road. There is no, and in this deal, I mean, I asked, experts in the United States, like Paul Gallagher, he said, this is what Alexander Hamilton did to rebuild the US economy after the revolution, because the US states were completely bankrupt. So he used their leverage from Dutch bankers to support the First National Bank. So China is basically doing the same thing. But in this case, Iraq is using its continuous flow of oil, 100,000 barrels of oil, not much more. Iraq exports 4 million barrels of oil every day. So 100,000 barrels could rebuild Iraq's economy over a period of 5 to 10 years. And there's no, the means of extinguishing the debt exist, but also the other lie that people, don't pay attention to is that what China is building, these are not like a port, an airport, railways, hospitals. These are not liabilities. These are assets. So China is providing assets to these nations. This is not it's not a burden to build a factory, a power plant, hospital, school. That's not a burden on that nation. On the contrary, it helps that nation to generate the income, right, which will allow it to pay back the debt. So the real debt trap was created by the West and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. I mean, many, many studies on that the real debt trap, which nations, and China is helping these nations get out of the debt trap by building a productive economy, which is make them capable of repaying their debt, including their debt to the United States, Britain, France, and the IMF and the World Bank. So in any case, what happened when that China-Iraq agreement was reactivated, and it was very clear that the Iraqi government had decided to go all in with this project, working with China, because the situation in Iraq in 2019 was exploding. You had hundreds of thousands of young people on the streets. The youth unemployment in Iraq is about 60%. And people get good education, but then there's no employment. There's no productive jobs where they can work. So what happened that as soon as Prime Minister Abdel-Mahdi came back from Beijing on September 29th, on October 1st, this protest turned into a really violent colored revolution, where people now were calling for the prime minister to resign because of corruption, because there are lack of services. But the prime minister was in China to change exactly that, to rebuild Iraq's services and give those young people productive jobs. So anyway, third party got in there. There were certain forces who started shooting at both the demonstrators and the police. That triggered a reaction from the police against the demonstrators. And really many young people were killed. And then everybody said the prime minister got to go, including the supreme religious leader told the prime minister that it's time for him to resign. This situation is not repairable. And then you see when the China-Iraq agreement was activated, oil started to flow into the fund, which was created in the Chinese bank. So the accumulation of the money was about to reach $1.5 billion, which is Iraq's 15% share in the 10 billion fund. And when Iraq reached that $1.5 billion in the fund, Iraqi oil money, the Chinese banks will add 85%, which is $8.5 billion. And at that moment, the Iraqi government will present its project to the Chinese side, the Chinese side will present 3 companies for each single project for Iraq to choose from these companies to work with. That thing happened the first week of January 2020. And guess what happens then? The United States, the President Trump or whoever got him to do that, they assassinated the Iranian Major General Qassem Soleimani and the head of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Militias, which are now under the Iraqi Defense Ministry. They were assassinated in a drone attack outside the airport of Baghdad. So Qassem Soleimani was actually, as the prime minister, the resigned prime minister said on TV, he said Soleimani was actually on a peace mission, bringing a message back from the Iranian leader about the previous message the prime minister of Iraq had sent or received from Saudi Arabia, because the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran was very high. And the Iraqi prime minister was mediating. So on his way to meet the Iraqi prime minister, Qassem Soleimani was killed. So what that triggered was attacks on the US embassy by these militias, and that was the nail in the coffin of the Iraqi government. So a new government came in, which completely froze the China-Iraq agreement. They took the money which was in the fund, because that money is Iraqi money. The Iraqi finance ministry has the right to withdraw at any time. So they took that money, and because the oil prices collapsed in the beginning of the corona pandemic, so the Iraqi government couldn't even pay salaries to the employees, because if you don't have oil money, you have nothing in Iraq, as I said. So they withdrew the money from that reconstruction fund to pay the salaries of the government employees. And the prime minister, the new prime minister, Mustafa Al-Kadhimi, even came out on TV after this thing became explosive, as I will explain, and he even lied and said there is no agreement with China, just a memorandum of understanding. But that was a lie, and then his own ministers later changed that. So the thing is that what we have in Iraq now is really, we are in a very, very decisive moment, because what this new government did also is that they are starting to work intensively with the IMF. They have like a whole month workshop before they presented the last budget last December. It was even published on the website of the IMF that they have had extensive discussions, a workshop for a whole month with the Iraqi Finance Ministry. And what this government is doing is going along the idea of privatizing almost everything, including the oil, including the Iraqi national banks, and so on and so forth. And the corrupt politicians and their companies and money bags are grabbing these assets. So that it's a really, really dire situation in Iraq, and it has to be reversed. And our role has been, I can explain that. It's been very, very important in this situation.
Well, let me just make sure that I'm understanding, especially many of our viewers might not be as familiar with this. So the previous Iraqi administration had worked out an agreement with China where Iraqi oil would be used to help capitalize a fund that China would then contribute significantly.
Yeah, a small fraction of the oil.
Okay, so a portion of Iraq's oil exports would be used to help build up a fund that China would then match with a large amount of credit, and then that would be directed not towards paying the bills of this month of the government, but only towards projects, as you were saying, that would make the economy more productive and be able to be paid back. And that in the middle of, as these negotiations took place, protests broke out that seemed like a color revolution. Soleimani and the Iraqi leader were assassinated. That this created conflict. A new government came in Iraq, and the new Iraqi government has not been supportive of this Chinese arrangement and is doing the exact opposite.
Yeah. The opposite of the previous government, yes. So, and many Iraqis say this is because this government is wholly backed by the United States and Britain, and it's serving the interest of the United States. I mean, people can have all kinds of theories, but we don't have evidence, but its actions show that that's the line this new government is taking. It's not elected government, by the way. It is there as a caretaker government until the next elections next year. So it's not allowed basically to tear down old agreements or start new agreements or start privatizing or changing the law. It has no authority to make any changes except preparing for the next elections and making sure that the Iraqi people have food on the table, and so on.
Right. Now, so I know, Hussein, that you've been, quite active in Iraqi political circles on the level of the government, and then also on the level of, popular movements or discussions among the citizenry about what kind of future they're going to have. What have you been doing? What kind of response have you been getting with your work on this?
Yes, I mean, there was a very interesting new situation developing. In January 2020, after the assassination of Soleimani, I was interviewed by you, Jason, to discuss that. Actually, on the Schiller Institute, yes, where I discussed this background to the assassination of Qassem Soleimani. But then I had gotten some information about the China-Iraq agreement. So in that interview it spread in many places, but at the time I didn't know all the intricacies of this situation inside Iraq and the China agreement until sometime in September. People in Iraq, some young people noticed that I had started the LaRouche School of Physical Economics in Arabic. And already in 2019, in November 2019, I was giving classes regularly every week on LaRouche economics. And young people were following this, but I also, within these classes, I was discussing the question of the reconstruction of Yemen, reconstruction of Syria, and the Belt and Road. So some of those young people contacted me from Iraq and said, look, we want you to give classes to our people about Iraq because you are Iraqi, now you're talking about Yemen reconstruction, talking about Syria reconstruction. How about your home country? You should talk to us how we should rebuild Iraq. And then they invited me on their Facebook page. And I think I have a slide there where the cover of the not the next second. Yeah, this is where I was giving these live classes on a Facebook page, which is dedicated to building the FAO port. This is a strategic port, which Iraq has been struggling for many years to build in southern Iraq. If you go back to the Southwest Asia map, where the maritime Silk Road enters the Gulf, and that's where it connects to the strategic port of Al-Fao, because it's a small strip of land which is squeezed between Iran and Kuwait, giving Iraq very little, outlet to international maritime transportation. So this was a very special and strategic port, but it has been delayed and delayed and delayed for many years. If you look at the design of the port, it took 10 years to build the breakwaters, the long arms to the right, to the east and to the west. Just these two things took 10 years with a Korean company and a Greek company, because there were delays the whole time. There was no financing, there was no long-term credit, and South Korea did not provide Iraq with credit. So every time there was no money, the work will stop. And so that has been a disaster, but this is a very, very important and strategic. So these young people were from Basra, most of them, and they said, look, we want you to focus on this too. So I started giving classes on the importance of the maritime Silk Road, the Belt and Road, but also on the idea, LaRouche's idea of the development corridor, and how that is key to rebuilding Iraq. I told them, forget about trade Iraq becoming a transit for trade between China and Europe. That's not really the issue. The real issue is to rebuild Iraq's infrastructure first. When you have done that, then international shipping companies will see Iraq as attractive, but Iraq will help also rebuild Syria, working with Iran, with Turkey, and the Caucasus, and this will become like wider and wider rings of economic development. So this group went from, this Facebook group went from like 10, 15,000. By November 2020, the membership reached 280,000.
Wow.
And I continued to give, but guess what? In that time, when it reached 280,000, Facebook shut it down. They said they went, they violated community rules. So, I mean, you have 280,000 people in the group, and people post things. Sometimes they post something which is irrelevant or wrong. That doesn't mean you shut down the whole page. So anyway, I was cut off from that, but fortunately, other groups had started other pages. So now we have, like I said, one group, we have like 20 Facebook groups, and they all broadcast my classes simultaneously. So that did not really stop it, but I also became a bit known in the Iraqi media as a result of that. I was interviewed, I was still being interviewed by Iraqi TV channels on specifically the economic reconstruction, the China agreement, the Silk Road, because I was told by people in Iraq that, most Iraqi economists, they left the country, but they said, we have nobody who is competent enough to discuss the Belt and Road and the new Silk Road. And added to that, my knowledge of physical economics, which I learned from Linda Darush, that gave me the ability to explain for people in a clear and pedagogical way the merits of the China agreement, but also on what priority projects Iraq should develop. So in that sense, this became, and there are other people now, there are bloggers, there are YouTubers in Iraq who all talk about the new Silk Road and joining the Silk Road and how Iraq will be affected, how fantastic this will be, and so on and so forth. So the interesting thing is that out of this publicity, and also the fact that the Iraqi government, the new Iraqi government, refused to give the FAO port contract in an open bidding because Chinese companies had offered fantastic bids to build the FAO grade port in 3 years rather than 5 years. They will finance it through a long-term loan. They will build railways and roads from the port to the Iraqi cities. They will build power plants in the FAO Peninsula and water desalination plants, residential areas, tourist areas. All these things were included in an offer from the Chinese companies, was CMEC, China Machinery Engineering Corporation. Instead of taking that offer, the new Iraqi government gave the contract to the same bankrupt Daewoo from South Korea with a commercial loan, which the Iraqi government have to go to the commercial markets and borrow money, like 400 million each year. So we don't know if the work will continue next year. So that created
So they're forced to, they're doing it where they get the loan each year to pay for that year's construction?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
And it's not long-term low interest rate because the whole contract with Daewoo is $2.6 billion. So the Iraqi government has to find a way of getting $400 million each year so the company can start working. But if there's no money, like with the water breaks, the work will stop. And instead of 3-4 years, the port might never be built. So that created a huge uproar in the population, and there are even demonstrations. But the interesting thing now is that we have a spontaneous grassroots movement started emerging in Iraq. I mean, it was not backed by any government, and they send me pictures every week what they do. Every Friday they go out and have these small groups. They even asked me to write a leaflet, short leaflet, why this China agreement is important and if Iraq joins the Belt and Road. The previous picture was from the Baghdad. This is the Iraqi Maidan. That's the Tahrir Square in Baghdad, where the previous riots and demonstrations took place. The next one is from Basra, from southern Iraq. These two guys, this is the greatest Iraqi modern poet, Badr Shah al-Sayyab. He's a symbol of Iraq. It's right on the Shatt al-Arab river. So they just carry a sign which says, we want to join the Belt and Road and build the foul port with China. We had people hanging these banners from highways. This is from the Najaf in the center of Iraq. I mean, I didn't really know who was behind it because the political parties are not interested. We're not interested in these things. We have in the next one is this, somebody put this poster on the highway. It says the Iraqi-Chinese agreement is the request of the Iraqi people and the future of our generations. This is in Samawa, in another city in Iraq. So they just posted there on the highway. We had young people producing these small posters, putting them on walls, putting on bicycles. They go to shopkeepers and ask them to have them on their window, and so on and so forth. Then we had, interestingly, some tribes in Iraq, especially in southern Iraq, in Nasiriyah, for example. This picture, this is where my father comes from. These tribes started also organizing these kind of manifestations, meetings, where they demand that the government reactivate the China agreement. So it started growing, and some members of parliament actually contacted me after having, noticed there was pressure from their constituents to do these things. You can show the rest of the pictures if you want, because this is really fascinating. I mean, those people, they just spontaneously did these things and went out in the streets because they now realized, because my message to the young people was that, look, if you think you can just change the government and things will get better, that's an illusion. Regime change never has led to any real change. And revolution, if you don't have ideas, if you don't have solutions, if you don't have a mission for what you're going to do, that's not really a revolution. That's a destructive kind of activity. So I said, you have to learn the basics of economics and statecraft, because what LaRouche physical economics is not simply, supply and demand discussion. This is statesmanship, where you learn the basics of economics, but also how wealth is made. What is the role of infrastructure? What is the role of scientific discovery, and so on and so forth? If you don't understand these things, if you come into power and you are not equipped with these ideas, you will be as destructive as the previous governments, and you will be manipulated to even destroy more of your country. So those young people are out saying, look, we will not be fooled again by anybody. Now we have learned certain things about economics. You cannot fool us anymore. You have to do these things which we demand, which were embedded in the China-Iraq agreement. We want to join the Belt and Road. We want to have productive jobs. We don't want to get just unemployment to get a salary so we can buy food at the end of the month. That's not what their demands are. Their demand is that Iraq should build a modern economy. And people are watching what China is doing. People are circulating all these fantastic videos of China, how fast they are building bridges, tunnels, ports, airports, highway, high-speed rail. And people say, we want like that. We want Iraq to become like that. We have the last picture of these young people. You can see these are maybe 15, 16, 17 years old kids. So they are making the same demand. We want the government to quickly implement this agreement. And you have to ask yourself this question. Do you want these kids to be engineers who will work on building the economy, building roads, schools, hospitals, being farmers? Or do you want them to join a militia and shoot at and get shot at just because they don't have a job? Because if you join one of these militias or anything, you can get a certain payment. So we have actually to decide, and the US administration has to decide that what kind of future you want for those young people. Of course, it's not up to the United States to decide what kind of future Iraq is, but the United States have enormous power inside Iraq. It has this reckless military capabilities. And instead of using that for creating more destabilization, insecurity, and even terrorist activities, they can shift the policy and join Russia and China in a dialogue to stabilize the region and start the reconstruction process, not only for Iraq, but for Syria, Iran, Yemen, all these countries, and turn this region into, instead of a hotspot for international geopolitics, into a workshop where all nations can work together to establish peace through economic development. That was Mr. LaRouche's message. This is still the message of our, Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization. And I think this is the best choice for the United States for foreign policy.
Thank you, Hussein. The extreme danger that's posed by the attempts to drive conflict among the United States, Russia, China, India to some degree, particularly Russia and China, these come from an attempt to prevent the kind of cooperation, or at least alliance, that should be natural among these three great powers. There's no need for the United States to see Russia or China as an enemy. And especially, in the past few years, the propaganda against China has been enormous in the United States, in part because of the coronavirus and the way that people have taken advantage of that to some degree politically. But overall, just this intense vilification of China, when our real enemy is the same kind that's faced by people around the world. The financialization of the economy, the enormous concentration of financial wealth in the city of London, and the manipulation of the Five Eyes intelligence services. And this is this is really the enemy we've got to take on. And we have so many common interests that. Yeah.
And most importantly, if you have that policy for the United States itself, you have to rebuild the US economy.
Right.
The United States have massive problems, not different than Iraq or Africa, in certain areas. The infrastructure, the power supply, the water, the healthcare, it's a disaster in the United States. So this policy will help rebuild and, bring the attention to the rebuilding of the US economy, exactly as I'm, advocating for Iraq, advocating that for the United States itself. The United States should use its power, its abilities, not in producing weapons and launching wars, but to rebuild the US economy. I think this is the best service you can do for US national security.
Yeah, that's right. What's the biggest threat to US national security? Some rocket attacks in Iraq, or the fact that the rail system is decrepit, right?
Yeah. Or the healthcare system, 500,000 people dead of the coronavirus. That's a disaster.
Yeah. So for people to be able to keep up with what we're doing, I just want to refer back to what Hussein had brought up about how his Facebook group that he was playing such an active role in was shut down in November last year. You're watching this video on YouTube, or maybe a different server if our YouTube channel has been shut down and you're viewing this later. I'd encourage you for now, subscribe to our channel, turn on the notifications so you stay up to date with what we're doing, but go to our website, schillerinstitute.com, and sign up for the email list. There's no guarantee that we're going to continue to have a YouTube channel or other means. So sign up with us directly so that we can be in touch. And Hussein, I want to thank you again for this really great perspective that you've shown us for the Southwest Asian region, and then how that really applies to thinking about the whole world and economics. So
thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm sure these young people, when the video is posted of this interview, they will be very, very happy and proud.
Great. Thanks again. And thanks again. We look forward to staying in touch and getting more updates on how your activities are bearing fruit.
Thank you.